I wish it was the size crowd at the tavern nowadays. Would it be agreeable with you if I should sit for a moment?
Yes.
Thank you. As a tavern keeper, there are two things that I'm rather unaccustomed to doing. Sitting is one of them. Speaking is the other. It is much more common that I should hear snippets of everybody else's conversations, never the entirety of it, and never be asked to participate in it. But I got a 19-year-old son who's got to learn how to keep the tavern sooner or later. Lord help me. And I have discovered that the very best way for him to do that is for me to give instructions and then get out of the way. And so I find myself with a bit more, I won't call it leisure, because it isn't really, but a bit more time to do other things and perhaps unfortunately, think too much. But it occurred to me that while many of you may have been customers for many years, we might not have ever met face to face, and I wish to remedy that. So if I may make proper introduction, my name is Mrs. Vobe. I keep the tavern on the High Street, commonly called the King's Arms, more commonly still simply Vobe's, and by some, the one across the street from the Raleigh. That was too much to put on a sign. But I thought the best way to proceed, since we may not have had formal introduction before, would be to tell you a little bit about myself, and then we may engage in whatever conversation you wish. Does that sound agreeable with you?
Yeah.
Very good. As I said, David, Learn and Keep in Tavern, that's given me more time to ruminate on things. Sometimes things you just don't want to think about, but why is it that if you don't have time or you don't want to think about it, that's all that's in your head? And lately, in my case, I've been thinking a great deal about the concept of home and family and what makes a place your home and what makes a place your community and what you can do to preserve it. Because in the eyes of some people around here, not everybody, but a few, despite the fact that I not only keep that tavern on the High Street, I own it, despite the fact that my son David was born here, despite the fact that I've been keeping tavern in this city for more than 30 years, because I was not born here, this is not my home. Now, I'd argue that point. I fought long and hard for the past 30 years to make this place my home. But it is true enough, I was not born in Williamsburg. In fact, I was not even born on this continent. I was born in London. And I know I don't sound like a girl from the streets of London, but I can assure you, find me when I'm overtired or a little bit in my cups, or my son will tell you angry, and you'll hear Fleet Street clear as day. But we arrived 1744, my husband and I, two little ones in tow. And the notion that we were going to keep a tavern, that was understood from the start. It was what we were doing in London, after all. But we came here for a fresh start. Finding a place to rent where the rent weren't too egregious, furnishing it, provisioning it, and most importantly of all, finding customers for it. Well, that takes time, doesn't it? And money. Honestly, a great deal of money. And I'll tell you truly, there weren't very much to go around in them days. There were no money to buy slaves. There were no money really even to hire in anyone. So most of the work fell on our shoulders, my husband's and mine. Now, if there was a little bit, can't really call it extra money, because what exactly is extra money? You know what I mean? But if there was a little bit more than we expected, sometimes we hired in a day laborer, or on one occasion we hired in somebody else's slave. But in them early days, most of the work fell on our shoulders. We'd found a place to rent where the rent wasn't too egregious, wasn't in the most profitable or prominent location. It was on a back street, but it was small enough for the two of us to manage. Now, I can say a lot of things about Thomas Vobe, but there were no denying that he were a charming man. Oh, dimples you could drown in. But while charm and smiles and dimples might get credit extended to you, At the end of the day, they don't pay your debts. And sooner or later, all debts come due. And I blame myself because I should have seen the signs. It wasn't as though we were without debt in London. Started out slow, like most things do. He started spending less and less time at the tavern, which left me more and more time with the books. And I started noting little debts creeping in here and there. And then I would go to one of the shops in town, and a shopkeeper might look at me and say, "Oh, Mrs. Vogue, do you really need all of that?" Or, "When do you think you might be paying on your account, madam?" There were some who were loath to offer me credit at all. And that's when the court summonses started to arrive, calling him to court for debt. And then, what I thought was the final blow, never forget the date, December the 31st, 1748. Men arrived at our door with a court order announcing that our property had been attached for debt. Are you familiar with that expression? Attached for debt? Oh, I wish to God I were not. But if your property is attached for debt, it means that they take an accounting of everything you own, whether it is in your possession at the time or not. In our case, from the 2 horses down to the last deck of cards. And the idea is so that they know what can be sold at public outcry, public auction, in order to pay your debts. And so it was. From the horses down to the last pack of cards. We were left with what we needed to survive. And I honestly don't know that all of his debts were settled to the last halfpenny, but I also don't know if the men that he owed money to cared all that much, so long as they saw some satisfaction. And you would have thought that would have been enough, didn't you? But I'm afraid fate had one more blow in store. A couple of weeks after the sale, I awoke one morning and he were gone. At first, I didn't think too much on it. I thought maybe he'd risen earlier than I, gone about the business of the day, gone to find some work or something. I'm not by nature an early riser, although having children and keeping tavern will cure you that quick enough. When he didn't come home for dinner that afternoon, or supper that night, or breakfast the next morning, well, that's when I figured that I'd seen the last of that charming smile. But what was I supposed to do now? Alone in a city that didn't yet feel like home. We'd only been here for, not even 4 years. I wasn't quite alone. I had my daughter Nancy. She was almost 9. I suppose if I could have found the means to pay for it, we could have returned to London. Quite honestly, I had already endured that 6-week journey once, and I was not anxious to do it again. And what would we have done when we arrived in London? There weren't nothing for us there no more. No family, no nothing. I could have put myself on the mercy of the church. After all, it's why we pay our tithes to the church every year, isn't it? Help take care of them what can't take care of themselves. At 9, Nancy was old enough that I could have found an apprenticeship for her to secure her future. I could have put myself on the mercy of the friends that I'd hoped that I had made. My pride wouldn't let me. And then one evening, I was sitting crying in my cider with the one friend I knew I'd made, Ann Pattison. I don't know if you remember her or not. She used to keep tavern at the sign of the Edinburgh Castle. And I was sitting with her one evening, and I realized I could just continue to keep tavern. And there were plenty of women in town doing just that, mostly widows. And I wasn't one, but I felt like one. I still had the building that we'd been renting because rent's due yearly, so it wasn't due for another couple of months, empty though it may have been. Now, if I could have found a means to furnish it, to provision it, I could continue keeping tavern. At 9 years old, Nancy was more than old enough to help. I'm certain we all helped our mothers when we were young. I could cook, I could clean, I'd been doing it all along. I mean, when you stop to think about it, keeping a tavern ain't much different than keeping a big house, except your children leave quicker. And there was one more thing that I'd nearly forgotten. I'd forgotten about my nest egg. See, I lost my parents when I was young. I was 3 when Mother paid her debt to nature, and not quite 7 when my father died. And my father was very particular in his will. He wanted everything sold, and then the monies were to be divided share and share alike amongst his surviving children, which at the time of my father's death, there were 5 of us, myself and 4 brothers. Well, we lost my brother Harry. We lost my brother Harry not very long afterward. So Father's estate got divided 4 ways, and the money's invested. Now, I mentioned to you that there'd been some money troubles in London. The truth of the matter is my husband bankrupted us there too. And you can imagine that when his London creditors discovered that he had married a girl with an inheritance, well, they wanted their part. So it came before the Chancery Courts. And the courts determined that since I had married before I had reached my majority of 21 years, I was 18, since I had married without the permission or even the knowledge of my guardians, I was in love. And since some of Thomas's debts were begun before I had reached my majority, that he and his creditors could not have full access to my inheritance, that the most that they could get was 1/2, and that the other half had to remain invested for the benefit of myself and my children, with hopes that if need be, we could live off the interest. Well, what better use for it than now? And it wasn't easy. It took a great deal of time. It took months alone to get letters from London proving that I had those monies invested. I can't tell you the number of times I had to go to a shopkeeper here in town and beg him to continue to extend me credit. I can't tell you the number of times Ann Patterson went and said, "Oh no, I know she'll pay." And to keep meticulous books. And I realized that what I needed to do above anything else was to create for myself a reputation that was separate from that of Thomas Vobes. So that's when I went about losing my London way of speaking. Because I also had to make people forget that I hadn't always been a part of this community. Now, there weren't nothing I could do about the name. Legally, we were married. There's no divorce in Virginia. The very best I could have done is sue him for what is called separate maintenance or bed and board, which would mean that we would still be married, but he'd be responsible for providing for me. Well, he'd already proved he couldn't do that. And I'd have to know where he was, which I didn't. And it took time. And it wasn't easy. But do you know, within a year, they was calling me a widow. Now you might say, well, what difference does that make? Well, calling me a widow means they recognize me in this community as a femme sole, a woman of business who can conduct business in her own right. I can take people to court if need be. I can also be taken to court. Both have happened. And it all seems like so long ago now. And I mean, I suppose it was over 25 years. But now, I've buried 2 children, had my son David. I own that tavern on the high street. I own 9 horses, 2 riding chairs, a cart, and 15 slaves. And one day, all of that will be my David's inheritance. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I've fought long and hard for 30 years to make this place my home. And I don't know what it's like where you're from right now, but I feel like my community's starting to crack. Now, I didn't become one of the most prominent tavern keepers in town by telling tales on any of my customers, nor by choosing sides, but I will tell you this. Them political discussions, they are getting more and more vehement. And grudges seem to be held deeper and deeper. The government hasn't met since last May of '74, when the governor dissolved our assembly, which means there's less business to go around. That's got everyone on edge. And now we've agreed to this Continental Association, this non-importation agreement, which means no more imported goods from London. Where do all your spirits come from? Abroad. That's got everybody looking over their shoulder. And if they're not looking over their own, they're looking over yours. I just see my community crawling closer and closer to the edge of a precipice. I don't know if there's anything I can do to stop it. I mean, I suppose I've crawled my way back from the edge on at least one occasion. I could do it again. I've always rather hoped I wouldn't have to. And I guess David was right. I can go on at length if need be. Please don't tell him that. The last thing I need is my 19-year-old saying, "See, Mum, I told you I was right." And I did promise you your portion of the conversation. So I would wonder what it is you would like to speak on and what you would like to know. Yes, ma'am.
Did you make your own ale?
Do I make my own ale? No, I can. I don't. It takes too much work. And quite honestly, ain't never been a single man come into my tavern and want anything brewed in Virginia. They want imported ales. But one of my guardians when I was a girl was a brewer, so I learned how to do all of that. And any housewife worth her salt knows how to brew beer, don't we? Yes. In the city, I don't have to, because there's plenty of people in the surrounding countryside that do. But under this Continental Association, not going to be able to get the imported beers and ales no more. I don't know that I'll ever find myself brewing on our property. It takes a lot of work, but I'll certainly have to buy it from somebody else if I don't. Yes.
Do women come and stay, come to the tavern, participate in conversation?
Do women come to the tavern? They don't usually stay with me. I've heard it said around town. I didn't say it, but I'll repeat it. If you want a good evening's entertainment, you go to the Raleigh, because Suthel's got that big room where he can entertain a great number of people for balls and concerts and such. Not that I don't have some room, but not as big a room. If you want a good meal, you go to the King's Arms. If you want a good night's rest, you go someplace else. So I do see women and ladies come to the tavern if they're traveling for food. Also, in the past, I have had concerts in my larger room, lectures. I had a portrait artist come through a couple of years ago, wanted to get commissions, so he put on an exhibition of some of his paintings. So that's when I see the ladies, but they don't club like the gentlemen do, and I think that's what you're getting at. The most common way for me to see the gentlemen who aren't staying at my tavern is they do what's called clubbing. I'm sure you gents do the same where you are. They get together of an evening, they rent a small private room. There might be food, there's always drink. Some gaming, conversation, be it political, familial, or business. Sometimes they're all one and the same. And then when the end of the evening comes, they divide up that cost equally amongst them. They call that clubbing. Now, while the ladies and the women of the town don't necessarily come to my tavern to talk about things, that ain't to say they ain't talking about them. They're just doing it in their parlors. I'm sure of it. Just like I do with my friends when we get a moment's peace. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry? Do I serve wine? Yes. Any kind of spirits you like. Wine, peachy, perry, brandy, punch, rum, beer, small beer, table beer, ale. If I can get it, yes. All the wines are imported. That's the trouble, isn't it? With the exception of Virginia brewed beer and cider, almost every other spirit is imported. Madeira and port probably being the most, fortified wines being the most common.
What are your hours of business?
Hours of business?
Yeah.
I don't know, what do you mean by that?
When do you start, when do you close?
Close? To be a tavern keeper, I gotta be able to provide food, drink, lodging, and a place to either stable or pasture horses. There ain't no such thing as close. Generally speaking, it's a little bit different now with David learning the business, but generally speaking, I'm up with the dawn If the government's in session, it's not uncommon for me to retire to my bed 2 or 3 in the morning. When the government's not in session, more like 11. There's always somebody in the tavern. I don't live there. When we first got here and we had the small tavern on the back street, there was no other place for us to live, so we had a room in the tavern then. But now there's a little house out back of the King's Arms that David and I live in. But there's always somebody staying in there at night in case somebody who's staying with us needs something or someone arrives into town late. But as long as I got a customer, and I'd be very fearful of the day when there were absolutely nobody.
How many people did you have working for you?
How many people do I have working for me? Hired man, 1. Just my barkeep's Duncan. But then I got 15 slaves and my son. Yes.
Very sorry to hear you lost 2 children. What was the cause of their death?
My children, my Tommy paid his debt to nature not too long after we arrived. He were just a little bit over 2. He were having the worst time of breeding teeth. They just wouldn't cut through, and they festered. And then my Nancy, honestly, your children reach adulthood, you expect they're going to be around for a good long time, but Nancy was 20 when she died. It was a very sickly season, number of fevers going around, and there were any number of people who got very ill, if not perished, from fevers that year. I don't know what it were exactly, but it were a fever. I can be louder than you.
Very loud here. Describe the worst brawl what started it, what
The worst brawl? What kind of place do you think I keep, sir?
I'm just saying, you mentioned that people are getting feisty and very opinionated.
It's mostly raised voices. It's never come to fisticuffs that I've seen. Maybe I won't be turned around. I mean, that's not to say it don't happen. There's taverns, certainly there are. The worst, I can tell you the worst one I ever heard of. But I've had nothing come to violence in my place, thanks be to God, and I don't intend to have it start now. Have you seen my Duncan? He's this tall. There's a reason he's this tall. Or there's a reason that a man this tall is my barkeep. There were a case about 10 years ago. This is the worst case I ever heard of anything happening in a tavern, but it weren't here in the city. There was a gentleman by the name of Colonel Chisel. He's had a house here in town too. Got into an altercation out in, I think it was Caroline County. The long and the short of it is the man that he got into the altercation with ended up dead at the point of Colonel Chisel's sword. They both were in their cups, words were exchanged, evidently andirons were thrown. It was all printed in the newspaper. The long and the short of it is that the other fellow ended up dead. Rutledge was his name. He was a merchant fellow. And Colonel Chisel claimed that it had happened, that the man had fallen on his sword, but if the newspaper's to be believed, that would have had to have happened through an innkeeper's coat across the table 3 times. Chisel was taken up to be brought here to the city because he would be on trial for his life. But being a gentleman as well, some of the gentlemen in the city met him outside of town and determined that he could have bail, which when you're charged for murder, you're not supposed to be eligible for bail. But some of the gents said, no, he can have bail. He's a gentleman. His word is his bond. So he spent the ensuing time on his property when most other folks would just be in the jail. And there were people very angry in the city about it, saying that if the shoe were on the other foot and it was a merchant accused of murder and a gentleman, would he have been given bail? And most folks figure no. But no, this man who is accused of murder was allowed to stay at his home. He even went out to his lead mines, 300 miles away. He was still in Virginia. He's a gentleman. His word is his bond. Everyone said, oh, no, not everyone. The gents said, oh, no, he'll be back. His word is his bond. Don't know that everybody believed it, but one way or the other. Sure enough, he did come back. Retired to his home on the back street. It was right across the street. I wasn't keeping tavern there then, thanks be to God, but it was right across the street from one of the taverns I'd kept back there. He was in his home on the back street, and the night before he was due to come to trial, they went to go get him to spend his last evening in jail, and he was dead. Now, in the newspapers, they reported it that it was torments of the stone. Most folk think it was self-murder. But of course, he'd never been found guilty of self-murder, would he? Because if he's guilty of self-murder, that's petty treason. And what happens when you're petty treason? All your property goes to the crown. So nobody was ever going to say it was self-murder. Well, people in this city was so upset about it, not just here, but through Virginia as a whole. This was about 10 years ago now, coming up, I think it'll be 10 years in October, in fact. You Virginians? Some of you? Well, just because it says that it's autumn, don't mean it feels like autumn. And that particular autumn was exceedingly warm. Exceedingly warm. And he was to be buried on his property in Hanover County. But folks was so incensed with everything they felt he'd gotten away with that there was some folks who thought maybe he ain't really dead. Maybe he's off hiding somewhere. And so a mob of people stopped the funeral procession to demand that the coffin be opened. It was a very hot October. Sounds like one of you was there. Evidently, they determined that there was a man in the crowd that everyone trusted, so they allowed him to peek in. And he said, yes, indeed, that Colonel Chisel was within the coffin. Property has since been sold, as you can imagine. His wife did get a great deal of it, if not all of it. He had other heirs as well. But that's the worst case of a tavern brawl I ever heard of. Thankfully, in my tavern, it ain't never come to fisticuffs. And I try to make certain that gents are encouraged to return to their lodgings if I see that they're starting to get a little more anxious, shall we say. But that's the difference, too, between the countryside and the city.
How did you manage that first rent payment? Within a couple
How did I?
That first rent payment that was coming due, you had a couple months to get letters back and a couple months the rent was due.
A lot of it was credit. That's how I managed the first rent payment. When we had to pay for the tavern at first when we arrived to give the rent up front for that first year. And most of that was paid for by the sale of the things that we had left behind in London. And then after that, it was scrounging, it was scraping. It was honestly a little bit of borrowing from friends, but mostly on credit. And the knowledge that thankfully my landlord back then, Mr. Craig, was inclined to believe me when I said I had the investments in London.
When did the inheritance come through? The inheritance, when did it come through?
I've never taken a full dispersal of it. So if I'm in need of monies, and I try not to, monies don't come across the water because of the Navigation Acts. So what I will get is letters of credit or bills of exchange. Think of a check. That's what comes over. And I have only taken disbursements of the interest. I have tried very hard not to touch the rest of it. It don't mean I don't have debt. I don't know a single Virginian, alive or dead, don't have debt against his name. We're an agrarian society. Do you know anybody who has absolutely no debt? I didn't think so. There's no shame in having debt. The shame is in not paying on it, and the shame is in having too much of it. So long as you are paying somewhat on it, you're just like every other Virginian. Now, I know there's a few extra questions, and I'm more than inclined to answer them for you, but I don't want to keep everybody here because I know some of you got other business to be about. So what I'm going to do is come over here beneath the tree, a little bit of shade. We can continue our discussion if you would like. Elsewise, thank you very much for joining me. Enjoy the city and safe travels.